when I started giving some consideration to the problem of motivation for social conflict. So I was interested in why people become rigid in their ideological identifications and in their cultural identities. And I was interested in really why individuals do that. So I started to get interested in what role social identity plays in information processing, which is hence the title of this course, which is kind of wordy and useless. But the thing is, everyone knows that we have social identities and ideological identities. They're religious, they're cultural, they're intellectual, whatever. But nobody's really paid much attention to studying how the representations of that cultural identity alter the manner in which we feel emotion, in which we perceive, and by which we act. I'm interested in how our internal representations of our culture modulate our emotional expression. That's the best way to put it. See, you know, your brain basically is programmed as you're socialized. I mean, that's what socialization is for. And obviously, it's socialization that instills cultural identity. And equally obviously, the process of socialization that leads to cultural identity must have some impact on the way you think, and obviously equally that on the way that your mind functions and the way that your brain functions. And see, North American neuropsychologists have been loath to give any consideration to this sort of notion, to think that cultural transformations might have some direct impact on physiological functioning. But the Russians, by contrast, this has been a central tenet of their neuropsychological theories basically since day one. This is particularly true with regards to Alexander Luria and what's his name? Vygotsky. Now, you can think about this, it's quite obvious if you think about it for a second, with regards to something like the capacity to read silently. Now, it is the case that, well, this is a relatively new talent. I mean, literacy is a new talent, right? Most people weren't able to read 500 years ago. It's only been 500 years, and only for a little bit of that the capacity to read has been widespread. And the capacity to read silently is a relatively new development in human history. Now, it's a peculiar thing if you think about it, that nonetheless, the capacity to read silently localizes to a specific part of the brain, which is to say, it's as if you have a part of the brain that's evolved for that purpose. It's the same place in everybody, more or less. There are individual variations. There are differences when people are lateralized differently, but all that aside, if you learn to silent read, there's a part of your brain that specializes for that, and it's pretty much the same place in everyone, and it wasn't there, or it wasn't doing that sort of activity 2,000 years ago. In fact, I read at one point, I don't know where the reference to this is, like so many things that I make reference to, but I read at one point that people thought Julius Caesar was a magician in part. I mean, he was obviously a remarkable person, but in part because he could read silently. He didn't have to read aloud. So it wasn't just reading that was remarkable, it was being able to read without talking. Anyways, the point of all this is that your brain, this is Luria's view of the brain fundamentally, is your brain is an organ that produces suborgans, culturally specific suborgans. That's its remarkable capacity, is that it can generate new modules that are specialized for certain tasks as a consequence of environmental programming. Well, this is an interesting sort of notion, which is to say that at some level of physiological analysis, at least, your culture determines how your brain works. Now, it's very plastic. You know, your brain's very plastic when you're a child. You can sustain immense amounts of cortical damage in childhood and still grow up normally. For example, if you're very, very epileptic as a child, sometimes what surgeons will do is take out a whole hemisphere, the whole right hemisphere, gone. And children who have hemispherectomies, if they're done young enough, still grow up to be relatively normal. Quite normal, in fact. And there are other cases, too, where people are hydrocephalic, which basically means that their ventricles don't vent properly. And cerebral spinal fluid builds up in the skull, so these people often have skulls that are slightly larger than normal, not necessarily obvious, but still the case. And they end up with a skull that's essentially full of liquid, with a very, very thin layer of brain tissue around this ball of liquid. And there are a number of case reports of people who have like 5% of the cortical tissue intact, who have high functioning intelligences and normal personalities. So the point is, especially the higher cortical levels of your brain are very, very functionally flexible in childhood. Now, by the time you're an adult, you know, the pattern changes a little bit. Kind of looks like your brain dies into its adult configuration. That's an interesting way to look at it, which is to say, you have way more neurons than you need, especially right before you're born. And environment prunes your brain down to its adult configuration. So, although of course you develop connections as well, but you lose a lot of neurons. So, and by the time you're an adult, your brain is nowhere near as flexible as it was when you were a child. And if you sustain damage to certain parts of your brain that are already specialized, well, you know, then you have the damage and you can work around it and all that, but it can still be really permanent.